We're back with the second half of a two-parter episode for a two-part omnibus line to talk about the second half of X-Men by Claremont and Lee. Perhaps the peak, this particular volume, of the X-Men franchise in a lot of ways, and I'm going to tell you all about it here on this episode of Crushing Comics. So, where we last left our hero, me, we had talked about the Volume 1 omnibus, which is the omnibus that broke the X-Men team completely apart, got it all the way down to the point that it was just Wolverine, pretty much, and then ends and is followed by Extinction Agenda. Now, Extinction Agenda puts all of the X-Men and all of the X characters back on the board at the same time together. So X-Men, New Mutants, and X-Factor. And they actually pretty much start this run, well, not quite the very beginning of this run, but they start this run kind of all cohabitating in the bombed out remains of the school in Westchester. Now, in addition to collecting Uncanny X-Men, this book actually also collects issues of X-Factor that bridge from the end of Extinction Agenda into the Muir Island saga and onto the relaunch of X-Men. And that's because they really don't fit anywhere else logically. And in fact, Chris Claremont did write some of them. X-Factor 65 through 68. Louise Simonson wrapped up her run with 63 and 64. And because this has X-Factor and Uncanny X-Men, this not only has art by Jim Lee in the Uncanny X-Men issues, but also art by Wales Portacio in the X-Factor issues, I believe. Yes, so that is pretty thrilling as well. And so two of Marvel's best artists that would go on to form Image. But what's in the book, right? So let's talk about the stories. And there are a couple of huge blockbuster stories. So in Uncanny X-Men, the team is all back at the mansion, and you're thinking, like, finally, they're settled, they're going to have hugs and kisses and get together. And out of nowhere appears Lila Cheney, who's this intergalactic rock star that can teleport people whole planets away, and she's like, you're needed in space, pretty much, and yanks all of the X-Men off of the property, leaving behind X-Factor and New Mutants. Now, what you may have forgotten is that we haven't really seen Professor X now for close to 75 issues, from issue 200 all the way here to issue 275. And so they're whisked away to space, and we're actually left in a cliffhanger, because the next issue continues the Rogue and the Savage Land story from X-Men 269, and I love that story. Not just because Jim Lee draws an amazing Rogue, but because I love Rogue, and it's a solo feature issue for her, and it's the beginning of her very strange ongoing relationship with Magneto, who we discover is also in the Savage Land. So we get this kind of like Rogue and Magneto as like Tarzan and Jane weirdness, although I guess Kazar's also there, and can Magneto be Tarzan when you've got Kazar? I don't know. So there's that thread happening. And then we go back to the X-Men in space, and we find out that there's some major doings in the Shi'ar Empire, which we haven't seen for a really long time in X-Men comic books, and that Xavier is there too. So we get an awesome space issue blowout with the X-Men for a little while, and it's got a really fun mix of characters that is really an X-Men team you'll never see again. It's got the core of Wolverine and Storm, but it's got Jubilee now, Psylocke and her Asian body, Forge, Gambit for the first time, and he's in like one of the dorky yellow and blue costumes too, which is hilarious, and Banshee. So like, what a weird, interesting X-Men team, right? So they do a few issues in space. Then we cut back to X-Factor, and in X-Factor we get X-Factor throwing down, I guess, is it against Apocalypse? I can never quite remember what's happening in these issues. I think they're facing off against Apocalypse. They're on the moon, and at the end, they're with the Inhumans. And at the end of this story, Apocalypse infects Cable, well, we don't know it's Cable yet, Jean Grey and Cyclops' son with a techno-organic virus, and they think he's going to die, and this woman appears from the future and says, I'm going to take him to the future, you've got to sacrifice him if you want him to live, and off goes this kid. Now, Claremont's writing these issues, and not only is Claremont, like, closing a loop here by, you know, like, connecting potentially this Cable to be the son that he had born to Cyclops and Maddie Pryor back in Uncanny X-Men 201, but he's also clearing the board of the kid so that he can pull Cyclops and Jean and the rest of X-Factor back into the main X-Men book. So then there's one of my favorite crossovers, which is Muir Island Saga. So as all of this X-Men stuff has been going down, the Shadow King has kind of taken hold of Moira McTaggart and all of her crew on Muir Island and has like infected them with, you know, this psychic awfulness. And Malice is there too, I guess, possessing Polaris. And so the X-Men like go to reunite, but actually find themselves all potentially in the grip of the Shadow King and battling against him on Muir Island. And I love it. Like, I know it's just this like 4 or 5 issue 90s crossover, but I just remember reading it at the time and thinking it was so cool, and it holds up for me because it's the whole cast together, and it's just like got some really big moments, and it's like a big comeback for Xavier, and it just feels like so earned. We've been through this big period where there's no X-Men. Claremont has been unraveling this team for 60 plus issues, and finally they all come back together, and we see them all back together in an epilogue in X Factor 70, and then the new X-Men book launches. It's historic. It's one of the highest selling comic books of all time. In fact, it may still be the highest selling comic book of all time. X-Men 1 from 1991. And I could probably do a whole video just on this one storyline, but Claremont has now maneuvered Magneto through being the headmaster, through being trusted by the New Mutants, back to the side of villain. But is he really? Or is he really just trying to finally follow through and say he's going to protect mutants? Well, he gets in a fight with the X-Men, so I guess he's not just protecting, but this involves some really bombastic action on Asteroid M, and if you're familiar with the X-Men the Animated Series cartoon, or any of Jim Lee's 90s X-Men designs, this is when they all arrive, right? Like Rogue in the lime and yellow suit with the leather jacket, Wolverine, is he still in the brown? Still in the brown and tan, although right after he switches. Colossus in his like trimmed down suit, Storm in the big like epaulettes silver suit, Colossus with the circle, you know, on his chest with the X in it, Jean Grey in her orange and blue. Like, these are all the designs that hit in that story, and it's just a great story. I've reread it so many times over the years. It was my first comic books and I love it. But then Chris Claremont departs the franchise. There had just been this tension with Marvel starting to value the artists more than the authors, and they were increasingly, you know, open to the idea of the artist plotting, but that meant the artist had more leverage over the story, and if you think about Chris Claremont, that was not going to fly. Now, Claremont had Uncanny X-Men plotted out through at least 300 at this point. He was already moving it towards that. The Wolverine was going to die. There's all these things that he's talked about, like on panels and things over the years that you can find online about what he was planning for X-Men. But he instead decides to step off of the franchise, and he doesn't immediately go back to another different Marvel book. And so Jim Lee effectively is in control of the X-Men franchise at this point. And you know what? Jim Lee delivers some freaking cool stories. Right after that Magneto story is the story that introduces Omega Red, which is a pretty cool story. And then after the Omega Red story, we get like a very traditional X-Men baseball game picnic story that winds up with Bishop and Gambit getting in a big fight, because if you remember, Bishop thought that Gambit was the X-Men traitor from the future, who we eventually get resolved in the Onslaught saga. Then X-Men has their blockbuster crossover with Ghost Rider fighting the Brood in New Orleans, and then finally we get the X-Men going to Mojo World to see what's ever happened to Longshot and Dazzler, which are kind of the longest absent X-Men from that period in the last book that broke up the whole team. So it's like immensely rewarding. It's a very, very satisfying 10-issue run with Jim Lee taking the reins. Now, of course, behind the scenes, Jim Lee is in the process of defecting to start up his own Wildstorm studio as one of the 6 founding studios of Image Comic Books. So Jim Lee makes his leave at, you know, after issue 11, and that's it for him on the franchise. They started this book, they got rid of Chris Claremont, who's not in any hurry to come back, and now Jim Lee is gone too. So, you know, there's this coulda, woulda, shoulda aspect of X-Men at this point. Like, what would have happened if Claremont stayed? What would have happened if Jim Lee stayed? Like, we got so much iconic material in those issues, and, you know, a lot of people bag on the 90s issues for having, like, crappy plots and for the artists kind of driving things, but guess what? Those issues are pretty good plots, because as we learned from Wildstorm, Jim Lee is a guy with a deep, deep imagination. He is very good at plotting, which is not the case for all the other Image founders. I don't want to, like, talk bad about any artists here, because they're great artists, but if you go and read the Todd McFarlane Spider-Man issue, adjectiveless title, which was launched for very similar reasons to give him more artistic control, it doesn't make a lick of sense at points. It is not as good as this Jim Lee stuff. Now, granted, McFarlane was writing, not only plotting, but also writing, whereas here, I think we had John Byrne and then Scott Lobdell scripting over Jim Lee plots. So Jim Lee was having a little bit of assistance. He doesn't tend to just be a writer all on his own. He tends to always find somebody else to put stuff in the speech bubbles. So this ends just a couple of issues shy of the Executioner's Song crossover. And if you want to fill those issues, you need that Bishop's Crossing hardcover. And that's an essential companion to this because it has the beginning of the Bishop threads that then cross into here. So really your reading order is kind of like Claremont Lee Volume 1, and then Extinction Agenda, and then Claremont Lee Volume 2, and then like probably you want to read Bishop's Crossing before you read this, and then, or actually you want to read this up until Muir Island Saga, and then read Bishop's Crossing, and then read the rest of this, and then read the rest of Bishop's Crossing, and then finally get to Executioner's Song. Reading orders are hard with oversized hardcovers. So this is really, you know, pinnacle of 90s X-Men. I mean, just look at the cover. And I love it very much. Now, the beginning of this through X-Men 3 has been released in Epic Collection, and the first 6 or 7 issues of X-Men has been recollected a whole ton of times, and then so has that little Ghost Rider crossover, but then after that, you pretty much have to get this in Bishop Crossing to get those last couple of issues before Executioner's Song. I'm sure we'll get them in some kind of paperback eventually, but we just haven't to date. So that is the story in this book, and wow, I know these issues pretty darn well. Probably better than I know a lot of the issues in a lot of the other classic omnibuses we might open. So now for the official shelving of one of my most prized possessions, Claremont and Lee X-Men Volume 2. Tune in next time for what is surely going to be a very different episode than this one as I continue to fall in love all over again, although that is one I have never stopped being in love with, here in Wellington, New Zealand, in my new bookshelf on Crushing Comics. Thank you so much for watching.